Good morning, Admiral members of this committee. I'm Charles Munger with the Honorable Sam Blakesley, co-proponent of the California Legislature Transparency Act, an initiative, constitutional amendment, and statute shortly to qualify for the November ballot. SCA 14, a proposed legislative constitutional amendment, and its companion bill AB 884, a legislative statute, have been developed in response to the California Legislature Transparency Act. If SCA 14 is amended on June 17th, is put on the ballot, I will not withdraw the California Legislature Transparency Act. Both will be on the ballot. I speak in opposition to SCA 14 on three grounds. One, SCA 14 as amended June 17th is an inferior measure of the California Legislature Transparency Act. In my judgment, SCA 14 will not and cannot work. Two, SCA 14 contains at least two completely unnecessary, quote, poison pill, end quote, my language, provisions that make it hard to pass. So if, as this legislature aspires to achieve, SCA 14 were the only measure on transparency in government on the November ballot, the most likely result is that it would not pass, leaving intact the present low degree of transparency in the California legislature. My third ground, a few of the things that SCA 14 seeks to accomplish, which the California Legislature Transparency Act does not, do not require a constitutional amendment at all. And if this legislature were really serious about those things, it would simply do them without tying them unnecessarily first to the uncertain prospects of SCA 14 appearing on the ballot at all, and then of SCA 14 receiving more votes in November than the California Legislature Transparency Act. So let me go through my grounds. We'll start with the first one. One, the structure of SCA 14 and of AB 884 is constitutionally flawed. First, no conceivable statute, whether AB 884 or any other, can bind a House of this legislature when it exercises its right under the California Constitution, under Article 4, Section 7A, which reads in relevant part, quote, each House shall choose its officers and adopt rules for its proceedings, end quote. If the legislature has a constitutional right to adopt rules for its proceedings, then no mere statute can tell the legislature what rules to adopt. That constitutional principle should seem obvious enough. The most recent case to address the point is People's Advocate Incorporated versus the California Legislature, appearing in Superior Court in 1986. It's Civ number 24645, Court of Appeals, California, 3rd Appellate District, May 21, 1986. This case was brought because a number of statutes were passed by popular initiative. In fact, Proposition 21 on June 5, 1984, titled the Legislative Reform Act of 1983, to constrain how the legislature might use its constitutionally granted powers. From this opinion, I quote, to accomplish the purposes attempted by the Act, a constitutional amendment is required. Only by means of an initiative constitutional amendment may the people modify or impinge upon the freedom of the legislature to exercise its constitutionally granted powers, end quote. The consequence is it doesn't matter what AB 884 might put into statute. A House of the legislature can simply pass its own rule in contradiction. A simple majority of a House suffices, and the new rule prevails over the statute. In case the honorable members think this constitutional principle is a dead letter without active application, let me read a particular statute, Government Code Section 9911, one of several established by Proposition 24 and still on the books. The statute begins, 9911, Assembly Committee and Rules. There is hereby created in the Assembly a committee on rules, which shall consist of the Speaker, who shall be chairman of the committee, and 6 other members of the Assembly, 3 to be elected by the party having the largest numbers of members in the Assembly, and 3 to be elected by the party having the second largest number of members. It goes on. Now, here I sit before the very Assembly Committee on Rules. Now, the Honorable Rendon, Speaker of the Assembly, is not its chairman. The Honorable Gordon is. This committee has 10 other members, not 6. Those members do not represent the parties equally, and none are elected by their parties within the caucus. But all the members of this committee, whatever their party, are appointed by the Speaker. Now, why? It's contrary to the statute, because though the people by initiative established the statute, this Assembly has since adopted contrary rules. End of story. Now, given this constitutional structure, were this legislature to offer me, as the proponent of the California Legislature Transparency Act, to actually write every single word in the implementation measure, AB 884, I would not even bother. The better my language would be for California if such a statute could constrain the legislature, the bigger the crash of public expectation when the public found out, yet again, that what would be my fine-sounding words constrained this legislature not at all. Now, if you doubt this, you can go figure out why it is that you're meeting here in contrary to statute. You will find the same research that 3 different attorneys I've had working on this point for the last 4 days have been researching and independently came to the same conclusion. Therefore, all we are left with to interpret the constitutional provisions of SCA 14 is its raw text. What you may choose to pass in statute is simply constitutionally and functionally irrelevant, and the only question is whether SCA 14 is or is not better than the CLTA, California Legislature Transparency Act. So let's take it from the top. Let's go through its provisions. As amended, SCA 14's provision 17.3a, commencing January 1, 2018, the legislature shall do all of the following with respect to its open and public proceedings. 1, cause audiovisual recordings to be made of all floor sessions of each house of the legislature, the committee proceedings thereof, at which a vote is taken, or other actions recorded, and the committee proceedings thereof held in the State Capitol building, regardless of whether a vote is taken or an action is recorded. We don't accept the premise of SCA 14 that the legislature should not record all its public proceedings, period. Why, if there is a committee meeting at which a member of the public has a constitutional right to be present, why should what that person would hear and what that person would see not be recorded for any person to hear and see? Now, I've heard about informational hearings elsewhere. Why on earth are you holding them if, in addition to you finding out interesting information or presenting it, the public who can't be there that day should not also be allowed to do it? What are you doing in those meetings that you wish to make it hard for the public to find out about? I will return to this point later. Going on, SCA 14 says the legislature shall, 2, make reasonable efforts, that's a quote, to cause audiovisual recordings to be made of all committee proceedings held outside the State Capitol building, which no vote is taken and no action is recorded. 3, make reasonable efforts to broadcast to the public in real time all proceedings of the legislature and the committees thereof that are held in the State Capitol building. When the definition of what a, quote, reasonable effort, end quote, might be defaults to what the legislature itself considers as reasonable by the setting of its own rules, these provisions are functionally meaningless. The legislature will do or not as it pleases, and not a thing would change if these provisions were simply deleted. Okay. In particular, all the proceedings in the Capitol building, surely the overwhelming number of such proceedings, but in those the legislature shall continue to choose which, if any, will be broadcast in real time, as it does now. SCA 14 goes on, the legislature shall, 4, authorize members of the public who attend the proceedings of the legislature and the committees thereof to make recordings of those proceedings subject to reasonable restrictions such as those necessary to ensure public safety and prevent disruption of the proceedings and to broadcast them. Now, again, when the definition of what a, quote, reasonable restriction, end quote, might be defaults to what the legislature itself will consider reasonable, this provision is, again, functionally meaningless. The legislature will allow only what it wants to allow. Yes, this provision mentions something necessary to ensure public safety is now constitutionally recognized as being sufficient. Wonderful. But so is, quote, preventing disruption, end quote, of the proceedings. And if a future legislature decides, for example, that having the proceedings recorded by the public has a chilling effect on discourse and so, quote, disrupts, end quotes, the proceeding, there is no mechanism to overturn that judgment. This provision is simply empty as it stands. Even taken seriously, the language to authorize, quote, members of the public to record is not the same thing as my measure provides, Blakesley's measures provides, each person has the right to record. The legislature might authorize some persons and not others. In particular, it might use its rules to classify certain persons, say the legislatures themselves, the staff, journalists, and so forth, as persons not, quote, members of the public, end quote, as the legislature, using its rules, will later define the term. Nor through the, quote, members of the public, end quote, who are, quote, authorized, end quote, to make a recording and to broadcast them. No constitutional freedom is given necessarily to transmit any part of them at will. Next provision, 7b. The legislature shall provide all of its audiovisual recordings made pursuant to the section of the Legislative Council, who shall make the recordings promptly available to the public. The recordings shall remain reasonably accessible to the public for not less than 20 years. Now, such recordings, if any, that the Legislative Council will provide that the legislature will provide to the Legislative Council. Oh, by the way, Legislative Council is not a constitutionally recognized office. It appears nowhere in the California Constitution. It was established by statute. So one of the little details is you have a constitutional provision which is making reference to something that is giving power to something that's outside the Constitution, which I will submit as a drafting error. However, in this language, and taking it as meant, it doesn't say how soon after the event the recording is made. The legislature shall undertake the task of providing these recordings to Leg Council. There may be a delay. Only after the Legislative Council receives them, the recording shall then may be available, quote, promptly, end quote, which is, of course, itself a term of unknown duration. An hour? A day? A week? Thereafter, the recordings will be, quote, reasonably accessible, end quote, to the public. Only the legislature will decide what accessibility is reasonable, again, by its rules. Perhaps one will have to travel to Sacramento to some office there to view and listen to a recording, but still not be free to copy, record what one hears and sees there. It'll be just like going to a small movie theater. Go there and listen, and then go home. Now, apparently, avoidance of specifying, as the California Legislature Transparency Act does, the legislature's recorder will be downloadable from the internet by anybody, is a deliberate policy choice, as the word, quote, internet, end quote, is actually used twice elsewhere in the constitutional language of SCA 14, specifically in Section 7.4c, Section 8.3a. Now, the California Legislative Transparency Act does not allow for these shenanigans. It requires access via the internet to the public and for the copies to be downloadable. Next provision, 7c. The legislature shall enact laws to implement this section, provided that, notwithstanding paragraph 3 of subdivision B of section 8, after the 2015-16 regular section, the legislature, a bill implementing this section shall not be passed or ultimately become a statute unless the bill is published in its final form on the internet for at least 12 days prior to the final vote in each house. Now, we've already noted that while the legislature can enact laws to implement these things, such laws will not bind the legislature anyway. In any matter, a subsequent legislature, simply by adopting its own rules, can void the effect of the statute, just the way the Constitution works. Even assuming such laws would bind the legislature, there is no requirement as to when the legislature must implement these laws. The next legislature might decide that a few years from now would be appropriate. And of course, the legislature cannot bind a future legislature. This legislature cannot bind a future legislature to enact any particular law anyway. Regarding the grand 12 days notice for any possible amendment, this is actually functionally almost useless. It doesn't change the fact that 2/3 of the legislature by itself, or a simple majority with the assent of the governor, can change the statute to trim the public's access to the recordings of the legislature's public proceedings to nothing. Now, a citizen viewing this meeting who doesn't yet appreciate the constitutional argument that the statutes in question cannot bind the legislature can nonetheless appreciate that even if the statutes could, that the statutes are changeable by the very legislature the statutes are meant to bind. And that little dynamic is a fatal flaw in the structure of SCA 14. Now, it is to prevent just such a possibility that the California Legislature Transparency Act was written as it was, with all the provisions that would bind the legislature put in the Constitution, without trying to rest them on any statutes. 7D1. Expenditures made in further of paragraphs 1 through 3 inclusive of subdivision A are not subject to section 7.5. What does this do? This provision violates the constitutional cap on the legislature's budget set by the passage of Proposition 140 in 1990. Whatever funds are appropriated will go under the Capitol dome and be hopelessly mingled with the existing budget for the legislature's operations, a budget whose breakdown has never been made public. If $10 million is appropriated, what should be a $1 million expense, which is the number the legislative analyst and I think everybody thinks is the annual amount, who is then to know? I would submit the honest way to get the extra $1 million a year, which we do not think at all necessary, would have been just to add $1 million to the legislature's budget as currently set in the California Constitution and just leave it at that. Bottom line, after being amended 4 times, SCA 14 has at last accomplished the goal, one goal, of writing into the Constitution that a bill is prohibited from being passed in either house until the bill in the form to be voted on has been made available to the public by publishing it on the internet for at least 72 hours before the vote. Okay? In our opinion, it makes a totally unnecessary deletion relative to what the California Legislature Transparency Act provides of the existing requirement that a bill has to be printed and distributed to the members for 72 hours before the vote. But let us concede that, as I said, they've at least gotten that far. What they have not succeeded in doing is requiring the legislature to make recordings of all its public meetings and allowing any person to do so. And we will argue the 72-hour notice period is therefore effectively unenforceable because there will not be sufficient evidence to a court, in practice ultimately the Supreme Court, to enforce it. What do I mean? Plausible scenario. A certain bill is supposed to be impossible to pass out of, say, the Senate because of the 72-hour notice provision before 10 a.m. on some day. The bill is in fact passed at 9:45. Why? Precisely to avoid having a noted opponent of the bill, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter, who is not yet present, speak against it. Well, after it's out of the Senate, the Assembly passes it, the governor signs it, this opponent sues to keep the bill from becoming a statute. Now, on what evidence is the California Supreme Court supposed to act? Evidence so compelling that the court will now overrule both the legislative and the executive branches of the state government that have approved this bill. What standard of evidence are we going to appeal to? Now, if there is a recording of the floor session, which is complete and entire, we presume that will be enough. But it is, after all, not impossible that by an eerie coincidence, on that critical moment, a cable will be pulled or a computer file corrupted at the critical interval, or even that in the official recording, the camera was directed resolutely to fail to record the crucial information, or any other little technical failure. You want a technical failure? Go look at the clock at the back of this room. I believe it is fixed at something like 6:45 because the battery is run down. If someone is recording this proceeding and that's the only clock they see, there's not a lot of information about when you would actually take a vote. These little things happen. However, the California Legislature Transparency Act, by providing that any person may record what their eyes see and what their ears hear, can pull out their cell phones or have a camcorder, and there will be abundant extra evidence for the court in which to act. And very notably, since these will be recorded on individual persons' own devices, never subject to this legislature's control, never subject to their editing or manipulation, or frankly, human error, those recordings will actually be there when they're needed. And that makes the 72 hours enforceable, even if some funny business or human error overtakes the official recording. So, as I said, SCA 14 cannot and will not work. My second point. There are poison pills, and my second grounds for objection, there are poison pills in SCA 14 that are unrelated to its essential mission and just make it hard to pass. One poison pill put forward is the change in the time interval between when a bill is originally submitted and when it may be heard in committee from the present 30 days down to 16. Whether this is desirable public policy or not, the authors should be aware that in 2012, opponents of Proposition 31, which included among its 1,000 lines both a 72-hour notice provision and this change from 30 to 16 days, was attacked, whether rightly or not, but certainly effectively, on the grounds that lowering this interval for the public to read the original form of a bill diminished transparency rather than enhanced it. It is frankly a known political liability, which in my opinion, no comparable public policy gain. The second poison pill is the funding source. As I said, Proposition 140 of 1990 established a constitutional cap on the legislature's own budget. As written, SCA 14 breaks that cap by allowing the legislature to appropriate unlimited funds, ostensibly to run the cameras, pay cameramen, so forth. Funds that, since the amount of the disclosure of its spending is up to the legislature to decide, will in practice be inexplicably and unaccountably mingled with the rest of the legislature's own budget. We disagree, firstly, adamantly on the policy. The legislature's own budget rose in real terms 5% last year, 5% this year, and we project it will rise another 2% next year, a 15% permanent increase over 3 years. And the costs of SCA 14 are about 0.3%, 0.3, or about 2% of that permanent increase. Now, the legislature already records and live streams about half its proceedings, I presume including this one, using its present budget. We think it entirely appropriate for the legislature to devote some of that increase to improving the information it makes available to the public as part of whatever improvements it may elect to make on its own with the remaining 98%. However, policy or no, clearly setting the precedent of breaking a constitutional cap meant to impose a fiscal discipline on the legislature to cover a mere 0.3 increase in the legislature's budget is accepting a big political liability for, in my view, a nugatory gain. Come on, people. You just passed a $170 billion budget. Here you are, ulcerating over a mere $1 million, and not even whether or not it should be spent, but over from which pocket the people should choose to pay it, the legislature's own budget or the general fund. This is a silly thing to do. I now go to the third of my three main points. You'll be relieved to know I don't have another one. There are two good policy ideas lurking in the general wreck of SCA 14 and AB 884 that can, in fact, be implemented at once and require no constitutional amendment at all. The first is from AB 884, to dismiss any state copyrights of its recordings of its public proceedings, instead put those recordings in the public domain. We applaud that policy. We call it to be implemented at once by an ordinary statute with an effective date of next year, whether or not any measure, SCA 14 or the California Legislature Transparency Act, passes, or even this very year by an urgency statute. Legislature has all of the imminent July recess to draft language, 6 weeks of the session from August 1 to September 15th to run the bill through the committees for public comment, etc. We note this approach would not only affect the recording sooner, but without any uncertainty about whether SCA 14 will or will not pass the legislature, or will or will not be approved by voters in November. That is, if the legislature is really serious about the policy. The other idea is from SCA 14. It's for the legislature to live stream its recordings. A marvelous idea. We suggest that the same supermajority required to pass SCA 14 in the first place simply at once change the Assembly and Senate joint rules to do this. You have the recordings, you're recording the meetings as they go, live stream them. It's particularly easy to make these rule changes since I believe a mere majority of the body suffices. Now, while it's true that each House currently lacks the hardware and control systems to record more than 2 committees working at a time, fixing this is in part why there is a $1 to $2 million initial cost to implement either SCA 14 or the California Legislature Transparency Act, it can certainly change its rules at once to provide that whatever meetings you're currently recording, they must be live streamed. Regarding the live streaming, it should be pointed out, we did not ignore the virtues of this when we crafted the California Legislature Transparency Act. We provided for it. We provided that any person, including a news organization, or a person with an upload capability to YouTube can make their own recording, which they can use as they wish, including broadcasting or otherwise transmitting it. Critically, including immediately. Those persons can live stream at once. Indeed, starting this year when the California Legislature Transparency Act passes, without any need for the public to wait until January 1 of 2018 for the legislature to live stream any of its own recordings. Though we laid on the legislature only the responsibility of posting their recordings within 24 hours, I doubt this body will let their recordings lag 24 hours before the news cycle for very long. In our view, competition can be effective as law in changing behavior. To conclude, the structure of SCA 14 and AB 884 is constitutionally flawed, and the pair cannot work as intended because of the fallacy in believing a statute can constrain the legislature whenever the legislature exercises its own constitutional right. The specific language in SCA 14 too often defaults to the legislature's own opinion about what it ought and ought not to do about transparency and what ought and ought not be available to the public to know. If such were adequate, we would have had transparency from the legislature long before now. SCA 14 contains unnecessary poison pills that make it hard to pass, and such ideas as SCA 14 and AB 884 puts forward that are beyond what the California Legislature Transparency Act would achieve. The legislature, one, they could implement them immediately anyway, and two, they could be implemented without any constitutional amendment, either SCA 14 or the California Legislature Transparency Act, if the legislature were serious about them. Now, whether SCA 14 would or would not be an improvement on the present state of legislature's current operations is an irrelevant consideration. The only question is whether it's an improvement on the California Legislature Transparency Act, and the answer manifestly is no. If this legislature puts this act as amended June 17th on the ballot, that question will be before the voters, because I will not withdraw the California Legislature Transparency Act from the ballot. Now, I will continue to appear at every Assembly or Senate hearing on SCA 14 or its successors, but make no mistake. Right now, SCA 14 and the California Legislature Transparency Act are miles apart, and there is no imminent prospect of any happy joining of this bill and this act. You're asking for a head-to-head battle on the ballot. It's that bad. And with that, I will open for questions.
Thank you. Will others in opposition?
I will be quick. My name is Tom Scott, State Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Business for California, representing 22,000 dues-paying members across the state. I am here today to speak in opposition to SCA 14, and really in doing so speak in support of true transparency through real reform with the initiative we already have, which is close to being qualified for the ballot. Transparency matters, and transparency from this building is a top concern for my small business members. Regardless of the policy debate surrounding the $15 minimum wage, what we witnessed with Senate Bill 3 in terms of process was a disgrace to the voters and all Californians. There was no public input, there was no analysis, there was no transparency. Now we have an opportunity for real reform with the California Legislature Transparency Act brought forward by Dr. Munger and State Senator Sam Blakesley. This initiative will qualify for the ballot since over 1 million voters have asked for it to be on the ballot. This initiative has taken several months to be carefully crafted. Now there are individuals trying to undermine that efforts in a few hearings. And I cannot ignore the fact that the established position of my organization and the 22,000 members I represent were omitted from the latest committee analysis. We've been on this in opposition from the beginning. And the fact that it was dropped or omitted was, very concerning. NFIB has been opposed to this measure for a long list of reasons. A few amendments taken on a Friday evening would not change many, my or many other organizations' opposition to this proposal. And to add insult to injury on this point, even if the amendments did alleviate some concerns, how would we be able to know, since the latest version hasn't even been in print for 72 hours? The very process by which this watered-down transparency proposal has been crafted perfectly illustrates why Sacramento cannot regulate itself on this matter. Over 1 million Californians 1 million Californians agree the state capitol needs transparency from the outside in, not from self-regulation. Now is the time to let the people vote. NFI remains opposed to SCA 14 and AB 884.
Mr. Chairman, members, good afternoon. David Wolf with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, also opposed to SCA 14 here today. Members, let's be clear. 72 hours means 72 hours. Not 72 hours in the second house, 72 hours in both houses. Both. CLTA makes this expressly clear. SCA 14 does not. Allowing individuals to come in and record hearings. The CLTA makes this provision very clear. SCA 14 does not. Those are just two examples of many where these two measures are fundamentally different. Members, in closing, just again briefly, let me provide a little bit of a history lesson. In 1978, there were two propositions on the ballot for voters to consider. One was Proposition 13, and the other was Proposition 8, which also provided tax relief, although to a less extent than Proposition 13. Proposition 8 was put on the ballot by the California legislature. Voters saw through this deception. Proposition 13 passed with its 1% property tax cap. Proposition 8 did not pass. 38 years later or so, here we are. The point being, members, these decisions have consequences that could last for decades. It is fundamentally important that we do honor, as Mr. Scott said, the will of 1 million people who have put the CLTA on the ballot, and we do away with the half measure before us, SCA 14, so that true transparency can be in the Constitution and can be in place for decades. I'd ask for a no vote.